It was a night like no other. A city, once bustling with life, was now a sea of fire and smoke, its skies lit by the glow of destruction. In just a few hours, over 100,000 souls would perish, consumed by the flames. Tokyo, the heart of an empire, was being torn apart, not by tanks, not by bombs falling from the sky, but by a new weapon, one that would change the face of warfare forever. The B-29 Superfortresses, the pinnacle of American aerial might, flew into the darkness, their bombs descending like hellfire itself. But this was no ordinary raid. This was a strike that would leave scars deeper than the ones on the city's shattered streets. A strike that marked the beginning of a brutal new chapter in the war. Tokyo's Night of Fire was about to rewrite history. On the night of March 9, 1945, the world would witness an atrocity that would forever alter the course of war and the fate of civilians caught in its flames. Tokyo, the sprawling capital of Japan, became the target of one of the most devastating bombing raids in history. It was not the first time bombs had fallen from the sky, but this was different. The B-29 Superfortress, a massive and powerful aircraft, had been designed for one purpose: to bring the war to the enemy's doorstep. And on that fateful night, it did just that, delivering a devastating payload of incendiary bombs that would set Tokyo ablaze. More than just a military strike, this raid represented the culmination of years of technological innovation, military strategy, and an unyielding desire to end the war. But the cost of victory was horrific. Thousands of innocent lives were lost in the flames, and the city, once the heart of an empire, would never be the same. This was Tokyo's Night of Fire, a night that would forever be etched in the pages of history, not only for the destruction it caused but for the moral questions it raised about the cost of war. The B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel of its time, was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American innovation, capable of carrying a bomb load that could devastate entire cities. Developed in secrecy, the B-29 was designed to operate at high altitudes and long ranges, a formidable tool for the United States in its quest to cripple the Axis powers. What made the B-29 unique was its ability to carry bombs across vast distances, bypassing traditional frontline combat and delivering destruction deep within enemy territory. It was a machine that could strike with precision, yet its very power made it a weapon of terror. By the time the B-29s began their operations in the Pacific Theater, they had already proven themselves in missions over Europe. But it was in the skies above Japan, particularly during the raids over Tokyo, that they would earn their infamous reputation. The B-29 fleet was not just a force of nature, it was the United States' answer to the question of how to bring the war to an end, no matter the cost. The decision to firebomb Tokyo was not made lightly. It was the result of careful planning, strategic thinking, and a desire to bring the war to a swift conclusion. General Curtis LeMay, the commanding officer of the 21st Bomber Command, understood the importance of breaking Japan's resolve. His mission was clear: to destroy Tokyo's industrial capabilities, cripple its infrastructure, and demoralize its population. But the method he chose was controversial: firebombing. Unlike the more traditional strategic bombings that targeted military sites or factories, firebombing focused on causing maximum destruction to civilian areas, knowing that Tokyo's densely packed wooden buildings would easily catch fire. In the early hours of March 9, 1945, the B-29 fleet, known for its long-range precision, took to the skies, carrying incendiary bombs designed to ignite massive fires. Each aircraft, loaded with over 8,000 pounds of explosives, was part of a calculated wave that would unleash hell on the city. As the planes made their approach, the city below remained unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold. Tokyo's air defenses, though formidable, were no match for the sheer scale and speed of the American assault. The city was vulnerable, and the raid was about to begin. The first wave of bombers arrived just before midnight. They flew over the darkened city, their engines cutting through the night. And then, the bombs fell. The incendiary devices exploded on impact, setting Tokyo ablaze. What followed was a night of chaos, terror, and destruction. The flames spread quickly, devouring entire neighborhoods, turning what was once a vibrant city into a hellscape of fire and smoke. People were trapped in their homes, unable to escape the inferno. In the streets, the heat was unbearable. The once lively streets of Tokyo were now eerily silent, save for the crackling of flames and the screams of those who could not escape. As the bombing intensified, the B-29 fleet continued its relentless assault. The planes circled above, dropping more bombs with deadly accuracy. Each wave added to the destruction, and by the time the raid was over, Tokyo had been transformed into a smoldering ruin. The firestorm raged for hours, consuming everything in its path. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. The scale of the destruction was unimaginable. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable, its streets now rivers of molten fire. As the night wore on, Tokyo's fate was sealed. The firestorm, born of the B-29's deadly precision, reached catastrophic proportions. What had begun as a series of targeted bombings evolved into a full-scale inferno, sweeping through the city with no mercy. The dense urban landscape of Tokyo, with its narrow streets and wooden homes, was ill-prepared for such devastation. What had once been a bustling metropolis now resembled a living nightmare, a place where the very air seemed to burn. The sky above, once black, was now painted in fiery hues of orange and red. The heat was so intense that it distorted the air, creating a suffocating haze that made it nearly impossible to breathe. The flames spread quickly, consuming entire districts in minutes. The city's infrastructure, designed to withstand natural disasters like earthquakes, was no match for the destructive power of a firestorm. Power lines, gas lines, and water systems were obliterated. The firefighting efforts were futile. The city was engulfed in chaos. Streets became rivers of molten metal, and the once majestic buildings, symbols of Japan's power, were reduced to rubble. Tokyo, once the thriving heart of the empire, was now a tomb. But the human toll was the most devastating. As the firestorm raged, the people of Tokyo were trapped in their homes, caught between the flames and the collapsing buildings. Many died of smoke inhalation or burns, while others were crushed under the rubble of their own homes. There was no escape. The city's population, already suffering from the horrors of war, now faced an unimaginable horror. It was a night where survival seemed impossible, and for many, the idea of escape was nothing more than a distant hope. Those who managed to flee were faced with the horrors of a city in total collapse. The streets, once filled with life, were now deserted or filled with survivors desperately searching for shelter. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of the flames was deafening. Some tried to find refuge in rivers, but the heat was so intense that even the water seemed to boil. There were no safe places, only moments of horror as they struggled to survive. For the survivors, the memory of that night would remain forever. The devastation caused by the B-29 fleet was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was not just the destruction of buildings or the loss of life, it was the breaking of a city's spirit, the shattering of a people's hope. Tokyo, after the firestorm, would never be the same again. The toll on the city was incalculable, and the scars it left on the people would last long after the fires had burned out. When the fires finally died down, Tokyo was no longer the city it once was. What had once been a bustling, vibrant metropolis was now reduced to smoldering ruins. The immediate toll was staggering. Over 100,000 lives were lost in a single night, an entire population wiped out by fire and destruction. Whole neighborhoods, entire districts, were gone, leaving behind only ashes. The once iconic skyline of Tokyo, with its gleaming buildings, was now nothing more than a silhouette of devastation. The world could scarcely comprehend the scale of the destruction. Tokyo, once the beating heart of an empire, had become a graveyard of its own history. But the consequences of the raid went far beyond the physical destruction. In the aftermath, Japan's resolve was not broken in the way the Allies had hoped. Instead, the firebombing stirred something darker, anger and a thirst for vengeance. The people of Japan, who had already endured years of war, now found themselves facing an unimaginable tragedy. The sense of loss was not just personal but national. Tokyo had been the center of their empire, a symbol of their strength, and to see it reduced to ruins was a blow to their very identity. It was a psychological wound that would take years, if not decades, to heal. For the Allies, the raid was considered a success in its strategic goals, but it came at a moral cost that would echo for generations. The firebombing of Tokyo, though effective in crippling Japan's industrial capacity, raised serious ethical questions. Was it justified to target civilians in this way? Could the war have been won without such devastating tactics? These questions would haunt military leaders and historians for years to come, as the moral ramifications of strategic bombing were hotly debated. The destruction of Tokyo also had profound effects on the future of warfare. It was a brutal reminder of the power of air superiority and the devastating potential of technological advancements in warfare. The firebombing of Tokyo represented a shift in how wars would be fought in the modern era, where the line between combatant and civilian could become blurred, and the consequences of war would be felt by innocent lives in ways never before seen. The raid also served as a stark warning about the consequences of war. The innocent men, women, and children who died in that firestorm were victims of a war that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Their deaths were not just the result of a military operation, they were the tragic byproduct of a conflict that had grown too large, too devastating, and too destructive to contain. The horrors of Tokyo's Night of Fire are a reminder of the human cost of war, how it can tear apart not only cities but families, communities, and entire nations. In the years following the raid, the survivors struggled to rebuild. They returned to the ruins of their city, their homes, their lives, to try to pick up the pieces of what had been lost. But for many, the scars would never fade. The loss, the pain, and the trauma of that night would stay with them forever. The raid had shattered not only the city of Tokyo but also the spirit of its people, leaving an indelible mark on Japan's post-war identity. The legacy of Tokyo's Night of Fire is one that continues to reverberate through history. It stands as a powerful symbol of the harsh realities of war, a reminder of the devastating consequences that often accompany military decisions. While the raid was a significant moment in the Pacific War, it also sparked a deeper debate about the ethics of total war and the cost of victory. As the years passed, the world would come to question the morality of using firebombing as a strategy. Was it truly necessary to destroy an entire city, to target civilians in such a ruthless manner? Could the war have been won through other means, without inflicting such unimaginable suffering on innocent people? In Japan, the firebombing became a symbol of the brutality of war, one that would haunt the collective memory of the nation for generations. Survivors, many of whom lost family members, homes, and livelihoods, would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. For them, the raid was not just a military operation, it was a personal tragedy that touched every corner of their lives. Tokyo's destruction was a wound that could never truly heal. The city was rebuilt over the years, but the emotional and psychological toll of the firebombing remained a silent undercurrent in the lives of those who lived through it. It became a part of their history, something that could never be erased. For the Allies, the raid on Tokyo represented a turning point in the way the war was waged. The sheer scale of the destruction demonstrated the terrifying power of modern technology and the ability of air forces to project overwhelming force across vast distances. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about the role of civilian casualties in wartime. How much was too much? When does a military strategy cross the line into inhumanity? These questions lingered long after the war ended, as the world grappled with the moral implications of using such devastating tactics. In the decades that followed, the firebombing of Tokyo became part of the broader conversation about the morality of warfare. It would be discussed in classrooms, debated by historians, and remembered by those who survived the flames. The raid on Tokyo was often compared to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with both events symbolizing the horrifying potential of modern warfare. Yet, While the atomic bombings are often seen as the final chapter in the war's devastation, the firebombing of Tokyo marked an earlier, equally brutal shift in how wars were fought. It was a reminder that, in war, the lines between combatant and non-combatant could become painfully blurred, and the cost of victory could be far higher than anyone had ever imagined. But the raid also left a legacy in the form of lessons learned. The world's collective memory of Tokyo's Night of Fire, along with the subsequent atomic bombings, would contribute to the post-war international movement toward nuclear disarmament and the push for humanitarian law. In the years after the war, the global community began to take a hard look at the laws of war and the protection of civilians. The events in Tokyo played a significant role in shaping the international agreements that sought to limit the devastation of future conflicts. The firebombing also influenced military strategy in the post-war era. The lessons learned from Tokyo's destruction were not lost on military planners. The idea of targeting civilian populations in the hope of hastening the end of a war would continue to shape the tactics of the Cold War and beyond. Yet, the haunting image of a city consumed by fire was a stark reminder of what was at stake. It forced the world to confront the real cost of warfare, a cost that went beyond soldiers and strategy, touching the very heart of humanity. The firebombing of Tokyo raised profound moral and ethical questions that still resonate today. In the heat of battle, military leaders are often forced to make difficult decisions. But the decision to launch an indiscriminate bombing raid on a civilian population was one that would leave a permanent mark on the conscience of those involved. For some, it was seen as a necessary evil, a tactic that would bring the war to an end faster and save lives in the long run. For others, it was an unforgivable act, one that crossed the line between military strategy and barbarity. The justification for such a brutal attack was rooted in the belief that breaking the will of the Japanese people would hasten the end of the war. The firebombing of Tokyo, along with other similar raids, was intended to cripple Japan's ability to continue the war and to force its leadership to surrender. The United States, having already suffered immense losses in the Pacific, sought a way to end the war with minimal casualties. In this context, the firebombing was framed as a pragmatic strategy. After all, the war had been raging for years, and the cost of continuing the conflict was unimaginable. The hope was that by destroying Tokyo and other Japanese cities, the Japanese government would be forced to capitulate. But the human cost of the raid was staggering. In the chaos of the firestorm, civilians were caught in the flames. Tokyo's population, already weary from years of war, had no defense against the wrath of the B-29 bombers. The destruction was indiscriminate. Women, children, the elderly, all were victims of the raid. The sheer scale of the carnage was horrifying. It was not a clean military strike aimed at an enemy combatant, but a wide-scale attack on a city and its people, many of whom had no part in the war effort. For those who survived, the trauma of that night would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The ethical debate surrounding the raid on Tokyo mirrors the broader questions about the morality of wartime tactics. In World War II, both sides engaged in strategic bombing campaigns that targeted civilian populations. The Allies justified these raids as necessary to weaken the enemy's ability to wage war. But with each bombing, the line between combatant and non-combatant became increasingly blurred. Were these raids a legitimate means of warfare, or were they war crimes in disguise? These questions remain contentious to this day, as the world continues to grapple with the complexities of modern warfare. In the years following the firebombing of Tokyo, the moral implications of such actions would be debated extensively. While some defended the raid as a tragic but necessary step toward victory, others condemned it as an act of terror. The debate over the ethics of the Tokyo raid would influence subsequent military strategies, particularly in the Cold War era, as nuclear weapons and other advanced technologies began to change the nature of warfare. The raid also spurred calls for stronger international laws to protect civilians during wartime, leading to the development of conventions aimed at limiting the use of indiscriminate violence in conflicts. But even as the moral debate raged on, the reality was clear: the firebombing of Tokyo had left scars that would not fade. For the survivors, for the families of the lost, and for the entire nation of Japan, the raid marked a turning point in the war, a moment when the cost of victory was no longer measured in terms of military conquest, but in the lives of ordinary people. In the aftermath of Tokyo's destruction, Japan faced a reckoning that extended far beyond the immediate toll of death and devastation. The firebombing, while only one chapter in the broader scope of World War II, would forever change the trajectory of the nation's post-war identity. For many, it was not just the physical ruins of Tokyo that represented the loss, but the deeper, more insidious effect the raid had on the spirit of the Japanese people. The city that had once been a symbol of imperial strength was now a shattered reflection of its own fragility. Tokyo's Night of Fire was not merely an event marked by smoke and ashes, it was a turning point in the psychological and emotional landscape of Japan. For those who survived, the destruction of Tokyo was a trauma that could not be easily erased. The images of fire and death, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, became etched into the collective memory of the nation. The survivors, many of whom had lost family members, homes, and their entire way of life, were left to rebuild not just their city but their lives. But how do you rebuild when the very heart of your civilization has been reduced to rubble? How do you reconcile the pride of a people with the horror that had been visited upon them? These questions haunted Japan for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, Japan's government, which had already been struggling under the weight of war, was now tasked with managing the destruction and chaos that had engulfed the capital. The nation's infrastructure was in ruins, its economy was near collapse, and its people were disillusioned. The war was not yet over, but the firebombing of Tokyo had already set the stage for the post-war transformation that would come. With the country reeling from the raid and other bombings, including the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese people were forced to confront the devastating consequences of their nation's militaristic ambitions. The aftermath of the firebombing also gave rise to a new national narrative in Japan, a narrative of survival and resilience. Tokyo, while destroyed, would eventually be rebuilt. The Japanese people, though scarred, would rebuild their cities and their lives. Yet the scars left by the firebombing ran deep. The people of Japan could never forget the night when their city was set aflame, when their lives were turned upside down in an instant. That night, Tokyo's firestorm became a symbol of both destruction and renewal, a moment in time that would shape the country's identity for years to come. The firebombing of Tokyo marked the end of one era for Japan and the beginning of another. As the war drew to a close and the nation began its recovery, Japan would shift its focus from militarism to rebuilding and re-establishing itself as a peaceful nation. The experience of Tokyo's destruction would influence Japan's post-war policies and its relationship with the rest of the world. In many ways, the raid helped define Japan's path forward as it struggled to find a new identity in the aftermath of its defeat. Tokyo's Night of Fire stands as one of the most devastating chapters in the history of World War II, a brutal reminder of the high cost of war. The firebombing of Tokyo, executed by the B-29 fleet, was not only a military strategy but a turning point that forced the world to confront the human cost of warfare. The destruction of a city and the loss of over 100,000 lives in a single night raised profound ethical and moral questions about the tactics used in modern warfare. Was the cost of such an attack justified by the ultimate goal of ending the war, or was it an unforgivable overstep in the pursuit of victory? For Japan, the raid marked the beginning of a painful chapter of rebuilding, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. Tokyo, once the heart of the Japanese Empire, was left in ruins, and the scars of that night lingered long after the fires were extinguished. It reshaped Japan's identity and its future, steering the nation away from militarism and toward peace. The legacy of Tokyo's Night of Fire is one that endures, reminding us of the devastating consequences of war and the fragile line between victory and destruction. It is a story of both loss and survival, of a city burned to the ground and rebuilt from the ashes. And it is a story that will continue to echo through history as a solemn reflection on the costs of conflict and the enduring hope for a more peaceful world.